Betrayal is a phenomenon that reveals the abyss between what a human being believes themselves to be and what truly dwells within them. It is born as a discreet whisper, an almost imperceptible movement of the unconscious seeking to compensate for something lost: vitality, recognition, or the simple sensation of being alive. When this impulse emerges, it is not merely an act against another, but a confused attempt to rediscover one's own center. In the light of depth psychology, female infidelity is not only a moral failing, but a symbol of the distance between the persona, the social role, and the soul that yearns for expression. A woman who cheats doesn't necessarily do so out of carnal desire. Often, it's the expression of an internal collapse. The act reveals a soul that has grown tired of pretending to be stable and has begun to move towards what the psyche demands: authenticity. This movement is dangerous because it manifests itself in the realm of relationships, where the unconscious speaks through choices, impulses, and silences. Infidelity, in this sense, is a mirror. It shows what consciousness tried to hide. It shows what was dead inside but still pulsating, waiting to be seen. Regret, when it arrives, is not a moral reaction, but an existential response. It is the moment when consciousness awakens and realizes that it was seeking outside what needed to be born within. It is the return to clarity, often accompanied by the pain of seeing one's own contradictions. The mind tries to justify, the heart tries to forget, but the soul only observes. Because it does not judge, it only shows the imbalance. Guilt arises as a natural mechanism of the psyche, signaling that something essential has been violated. It is not punishment, it is a compass. Analytical psychology views error not as ruin, but as a calling. Everything that is repressed takes shape in the world to be integrated. The act of betrayal, from this perspective, is the cry of a part of the personality that could no longer bear to live suffocated. It is the shadow asking for light. And when this shadow reveals itself, the ego experiences a kind of rupture. It realizes that it is not as whole as it imagined. Shame appears, not because of the gaze of others, but because of having betrayed one's own ideal self. This is the deepest pain, not the loss of the other, but the loss of inner coherence. Understanding this process doesn't require immediate forgiveness, but clarity. It takes courage to look at what was truly behind the act. Each person carries an invisible symbolic system, formed by unresolved fears, memories, and desires. Betrayal is often the manifestation of a saturated psyche, breaking through the barriers of morality to remind us that the soul cannot bear to live imprisoned in roles. When remorse arises, it can be the beginning of a process of individuation, the moment when the human being begins to integrate what they previously denied. But this only happens when there is enough silence to hear what the unconscious was trying to say. The figure guiding this reflection does not point fingers. She observes, interprets, and translates. She sees betrayal as the symbolic language of the soul, not as a sentence. She shows that human beings are always caught between light and shadow, between desire and duty, and that denying one of these poles is the quickest path to fragmentation. True learning is born when one understands that every act, however painful, reveals a blind attempt at balance. When you look deeply, you realize that genuine repentance is the beginning of reconciliation between the ego and the soul. It doesn't ask for forgiveness, it awakens consciousness. In this awakening, the person understands that true fidelity is not only to the other, but to one's own essence. Infidelity, then, ceases to be a label and becomes a symbol of the oldest human conflict, that of living divided between what one is and what one appears to be. And only those who recognize this division can truly begin to become whole. There is a silent moment between the act and awareness, an almost imperceptible pause where everything seems suspended. In this interval, reality has not yet collapsed, and the mind tries to maintain the illusion of control. It is in this space that the human being begins to perceive the symbolic dimension of their choices. The woman who cheated believes for a moment that she can compartmentalize life, leaving emotion on one side, commitment on the other, and morality in some corner of her consciousness. But the unconscious does not respect divisions. It crosses boundaries and reveals what has been denied. So, even before the discovery, something inside her already begins to crumble. In everyday life, this manifests itself in subtle ways: a distraction at work, a longer silence in usual conversations. a growing impatience with small things. The body betrays what the mind tries to hide. Betrayal, which seemed to liberate, now imprisons in a constant tension between secrecy and truth. Every banal gesture becomes laden with meaning. The ringing of the phone, the partner's gaze, the mirror upon waking. The psyche transforms the world into a symbol, and everything begins to reflect what has been done. It is the soul trying to restore the lost balance. Regret arises gradually, like a fog obscuring reason. First comes discomfort, then recurring memories, and finally, the weight. Not the weight of external judgment, but that of one's own inconsistency. It is when the person realizes that, in deceiving the other, it was their own center that lost its form. There is no victory in disloyalty, there is only dispersion. The pleasure of the moment dissolves quickly, and what remains is the feeling of having crossed a boundary that cannot be undone. The unconscious then begins to work silently, causing dreams, lapses, and small emotional collapses. Everything that was denied returns, demanding a new perspective. Some try to neutralize this tension by immersing themselves in more activity, more distraction. Working too much, talking too much, laughing too much. But the more one tries to escape, the stronger the internal echo becomes. This is how human beings discover that regret is not cured by forgetting, but by integration. The mistake does not disappear. It needs to be understood. And understanding requires pause. It requires courage to face what one tried to deny. The psyche cannot bear the void of meaning, and always pushes the individual back to the point where they got lost. The conflict between desire and value intensifies. It's a struggle that repeats itself within each person, albeit in different contexts. Ultimately, it's not about betrayal, but about fragmentation. Infidelity becomes a symbol of something greater, the loss of the link between what one feels and what one chooses. And it is at this point that many realize that true suffering doesn't come from the mistake itself, but from the distance between who one is and who one expected to be. When consciousness awakens, it asks not only why, but also what for. What need drove the act? What was truly being sought in that moment of loss of control? The unconscious doesn't act by chance. It manifests itself to restore what has been repressed. Often, betrayal arises as a distorted attempt to rediscover one's own power, to feel that one still has a choice, that one can still provoke movement in the world. But every choice disconnected from essence exacts a price. Regret is that price, a symbolic bill that arrives to remind us that freedom without conscience is merely disguised escape, and every escape, sooner or later, demands a return. There's an image that translates this process. Imagine an old mirror with cracks that distort the reflection. Each crack represents a choice made unconsciously, a value ignored, a limit crossed. Regret is the moment when the eye finally recognizes the cracks. It's painful, but also liberating, because only those who see the damage can begin to restore it. The mirror doesn't return to being the same, but it becomes more truthful. The imperfect surface now reflects with depth. Thus continues the inner journey after infidelity. The mind tries to erase, but the soul wants to understand. It is the inevitable confrontation between disguise and awakening. Some resist, others dive in. And those who dive in discover that regret is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of the reconstruction of a truth that already existed, but was forgotten beneath the noise of momentary desires. It is when the human being finally begins to listen to their own soul in silence. There comes a moment when guilt ceases to be merely a feeling and transforms into a mirror. Everything that once seemed justifiable begins to lose its color. The mind tries to construct arguments, but the body refuses. Sleep becomes fragmented. Appetite changes. The gaze wanders for seconds into silent places. Regret matures when consciousness understands that the act cannot be undone, but can be understood. It is at this instant that the human being begins to dialogue with something deeper than remorse, the need for reconciliation with their own soul. The mistake takes on a face, and that face is that of their own shadow. It is at this point that many seek refuge in rationalization. They say it was the moment, chance, loneliness, neediness. But these words only serve to postpone real contact with the pain. The mind fears silence because in it there are no justifications. And without justifications, only the naked, raw, inescapable fact remains. The unconscious demands this encounter. It asks the individual to stop running and look. Suffering, then, becomes a rite of passage. The more one tries to escape, the more life pushes inward. Regret, when well lived, is a bridge between error and self-knowledge. But who truly crosses that bridge? The fear of self-recognition is what keeps many prisoners of guilt. It's easier to bear the weight of shame than the responsibility of change. The human psyche has a dangerous tendency to prefer known suffering to unknown freedom. And here, a paradox arises. Betrayal, which initially seemed like an act of freedom, becomes the narrowest prison. The individual realizes that their prison is not made of external walls, but of recurring thoughts. And the question inevitably arises, how long is it possible to live divided between memory and denial? Days pass, and the unconscious continues its silent work. It sends signals in the form of coincidences, reunions, lapses in memory, dreams. Reality bends to guide the psyche to the point of origin of the imbalance. What seemed casual reveals itself as necessary. Everything somehow returns to the lesson that needs to be learned. The woman who betrayed and regrets it is not only reviewing what she did, she is being called to understand who she has become. The betrayal, then, ceases to be an event and becomes a symbol, the symbol of an unconscious search for integration. But what was really being sought? To be seen, to be desired, to be free. None of these answers is sufficient. They are all merely surfaces of a deeper issue, the need to reconnect with one's own worth. When an individual disconnects from their essential value, they begin to seek validation in external mirrors, and these mirrors never reflect the true image. Infidelity, in this context, is an attempt to see reflected what has been lost within. However, the reflection is always distorted, and the more one looks at it, the further one becomes from oneself. Consciousness, upon perceiving this trap, faces a dilemma. What to do with the weight of what has been revealed? Pretend nothing happened? Seek immediate redemption? The answer lies not in either extreme. It lies in serene observation, in the lucid acceptance that every human being is composed of contradictions. The shadow is not an error of creation, but part of the balance. To reject it is to remain on the surface of one's own history. To integrate it is to transform regret into wisdom. But how many have the courage to look at themselves without disguises? It is at this point that silence takes on a sacred role. Not the silence that flees, but the silence that listens. It is in silence that the soul begins to respond. Regret, when heard without resistance, reveals hidden layers. The fear of being forgotten, the emptiness of not being understood, the pain of having become invisible to oneself. Each exposed layer is a step towards lost unity. Suffering is not punishment, it is an invitation to wholeness. And it is precisely when the individual thinks they are falling apart that something deeper begins to be born. The human psyche, when it goes through this process, is never the same again. The mistake becomes a turning point, and repentance, in symbolic language, becomes the beginning of a new inner ethic. What was once guilt is now conscience. What was once fear is now maturity. Infidelity ceases to be merely a story about desire and becomes a portrait of the awakening of the soul. And this awakening, although born of pain, is the first sign of a freedom that no longer depends on secrets, but on truth. When regret matures, something silently changes within the psyche. The woman, who once tried to erase what she did now, observes with distance, like someone watching a film she knows well, but only now understands the script. Emotion gives way to analysis, and it is at this point that the human mind reveals its complexity. It is no longer about the mistake itself, but about what it exposed, the fragility of certainties and the power of the unconscious to guide choices that the ego would never admit. It is as if life creates specific situations so that the soul learns what reasoning refused to understand. Interestingly, many behavioral studies indicate that genuine remorse alters how the brain processes memories. Regions linked to pleasure decrease their activity, while those associated with reflection and moral control intensify. The mind seeks repair, and the body follows suit. What once triggered adrenaline now causes aversion. It's the body's attempt to restore psychic balance. It's not divine punishment. It's the nervous system trying to teach that pleasure without awareness exacts a high price. A symbolic account illustrates this. Once, a woman described the day she realized the betrayal had ended, even before it was discovered. She recounted waking up and feeling the air change, as if the room were smaller. The walls seemed to be watching. Her body felt heavy, not with fear, but with lucidity. The external scene was ordinary, but something inside her had changed forever. It was the exact moment when the unconscious closed the cycle. Regret didn't come with tears, but with a serenity that was startling. She said she understood, without words, that love doesn't survive internal inconsistency. This type of perception is what transforms error into a tool for expansion. Regret, when genuine, produces a paradoxical effect. It illuminates. It shows the invisible structure behind actions. It reveals the repeated pattern, the old need, the hidden fear. The human being begins to see their motivations like an archaeologist before ruins, fragments of themselves scattered through time. Each memory becomes a clue, each pain, evidence. And the more the story is reconstructed, the more one realizes that the betrayal was merely a symbol, an episode that represented the struggle between instinct and value. But what happens when clarity arrives too late? When the relationship has already crumbled, when the other person has already left, when forgiveness is impossible? The answer is not simple. The unconscious mind is not concerned with results, only with integration. Healing does not depend on reunion, but on the ability to understand what the experience tried to teach. It is possible that the relationship ends, but the learning remains. And this learning has a purpose: to prepare the soul to love truly. Repentance, in this sense, is the ground where a new form of fidelity is born, not to the other, but to one's own essence. There is a symbolic dimension in the way guilt transforms into wisdom. At first, it weighs us down. Then, it guides us. It's the same psychic material, only transmuted by consciousness. Like lead turning to gold in alchemy, remorse becomes introspection, and pain gives way to serenity. This process requires time, silence, and a dose of humility. There are no shortcuts. The mind tries to hasten the cycle, but the unconscious has its own rhythm. And it is in this slow pace that the deepest truths are revealed. In some cases, regret awakens the desire to repair, to confess, to start over. But the other person doesn't always want to listen. And that's also part of the learning process. True reparation doesn't depend on the acceptance of others, but on inner reconstruction. The soul needs to feel whole, even if the external world remains fragmented. It is at this point that the human being begins to mature spiritually. They understand that they don't control the outcomes, only the intentions. Ultimately, every story of betrayal is, at its core, a story about conscience. The act itself is merely the stage where the psyche enacts its conflicts. Regret is the second act, the one in which the character realizes that the script was about them all along. When this understanding arrives, suffering loses its punitive meaning and becomes enlightenment. Pain is no longer remembered as a fall, but as the beginning of ascension. And it is at this moment that silence, once oppressive, returns to being present, not of guilt, but of wisdom. There comes a point when regret ceases to be a memory and becomes living energy. It stirs within, demanding transformation. It's the moment when the past stops being a burden and becomes a force, still raw, that pushes the individual towards something new. Consciousness matures when it understands that it's impossible to erase what has been done, but it is possible to change the meaning of what has been lived. It is at this stage that the psyche begins to react differently. Dreams change tone, emotions oscillate between pain and relief, and a restlessness difficult to name arises, as if something were demanding to be expressed. The soul wants to rebuild itself, and to do so, it needs to traverse the final chaos before clarity. Tension grows when a person realizes that external forgiveness may never come. It's a shock that shatters the illusion of control. Many spend days waiting for a word, a gesture, a chance to fix things. But life rarely returns things to the way they were before. What has broken inside can only be restored from within. This realization is harsh because it forces the individual to accept their own solitude as part of the healing process. There are no witnesses to this process. The soul closes itself off from the world and begins to speak only to those who have the courage to listen, its own conscience. And that's where the true confrontation occurs, not with the other, but with the reflection. Some try to deny this calling and carry on as if nothing had happened. They feign normalcy, but the mind is not deceived. The unconscious does not allow a return to ignorance. It repeats lessons, changes faces, changes contexts, but maintains the same plot until the message is understood. Repetition is a sign that the lesson has not yet been integrated. And when consciousness perceives this pattern, the initial fear transforms into curiosity. What is destiny trying to teach? What is still being denied? The answer is almost always in small daily choices, in automatic gestures, in reactions that seem without reason. It is there that the unconscious reveals itself, demanding attention. In some stories, regret transforms into a desire for reconstruction. The person tries to start over differently, more awake, more honest. But life demands proof, and the proof always comes disguised as temptation. A reunion, an unexpected message, a chance encounter that repeats the old story. It's the silent test of the psyche. It wants to know if the learning is real or just rhetoric. The tension grows again, and the individual feels the weight of the choice. Returning to the pattern is easy, but remaining conscious is what truly transforms. Freedom begins at that exact point, when one chooses the new path, even without guarantees. There's something mysterious about this process. It's as if the soul, after falling, learns to walk in a different way. Regret becomes practical wisdom. Reactions become slower, decisions more thoughtful, the gaze deeper. The person who has truly overcome guilt acquires a kind of serenity that is difficult to explain. They are not the same person who erred, nor the same person who suffered. It's a new way of being, shaped by pain, but guided by lucidity. It is in this state that love regains meaning, not as dependence or an ideal, but as conscious presence. Fidelity at this stage ceases to be a commitment to someone and becomes a commitment to one's own truth. The turning point comes when the individual realizes that the betrayal, contrary to what was believed, did not destroy them. It unmasked them. It shattered their defenses, their images, their roles. It revealed what was dormant and forced them to reinvent themselves. This is the final transformation, understanding that the mistake was the beginning of maturity. No remorse is in vain when experienced with lucidity. No pain is lost when used to grow. Regret, then, ceases to be the end of a story and becomes the beginning of a broader inner journey. The soul, which was previously hidden, now reveals itself entirely, and for the first time in silence, knows that true forgiveness is not received, it is lived. Every journey of awareness ends at the same point where it began, within yourself. Betrayal, regret, silence, it's all part of a cycle with a single purpose: awakening. Not the awakening of someone seeking to understand the past in detail, but of someone who finally accepts what they are, without masks. Painful experience, when understood, doesn't define the person, but shapes their essence. What seemed like ruin becomes fertile ground for something new. There is power in recognizing one's own shadow, because it is there that the forgotten forces of the soul are hidden. It is from this encounter that true transformation is born. From that point on, regret is no longer punishment, but clarity. It teaches us to think before acting, to listen before speaking, to perceive before judging. Human beings mature when they understand that consciousness doesn't grow in comfort, but in friction. The wounds that the ego tries to hide are, in fact, the doors that lead to inner freedom. Only those who have been deeply lost can understand the value of rediscovering themselves. And this rediscovery doesn't happen all at once. It's daily, discreet, built in simple gestures, in the way we look, speak, and manage our time. Each action becomes a mirror of this new state of presence. Some people ask if it's possible to love again after a mistake. The answer is yes, but the love that is reborn after a fall is different. It's not anxious or needy. It's a love born from the recognition of imperfection. To love after confronting one's own shadow is to love with open eyes. It's understanding that the other is not a mirror to fill voids, but a presence with whom one shares awareness. Fidelity, in this sense, ceases to be an obligation and becomes a choice. And this choice is renewed every day, sustained by attention and truth. Learning is complete when a person realizes that the mistake was merely the setting where the soul rehearsed forgiveness. Not the forgiveness you ask for, but the forgiveness you grant yourself upon recognizing that you were blind, confused, wounded. From then on, guilt dissolves and gives way to responsibility. A new ethic emerges, more silent, more authentic. It is the understanding that living coherently is the greatest act of love possible. What was once a fall is now a symbol of ascension. And whoever walks this path, without denying what they have experienced, carries a serenity that the world cannot take away. Ultimately, all true regret leads to the same discovery. The human being is greater than their mistake. When this realization takes hold, the past loses its power to imprison. Memory ceases to be an open wound and becomes a scar that teaches. The unconscious, once a field of disordered forces, becomes an ally of consciousness. The individual learns to live attentively, with presence, with respect for their own rhythm. You discover that there is no way to erase what was, but there is always a way to choose what will be. And that choice is the seed of a new life. Deep psychology teaches that healing is not linear. It happens in spirals. The same theme may return, but with each turn, there is more understanding. The pain diminishes, clarity increases, and the heart expands. The woman who betrayed and repented is no longer the same. She now knows the price of unconsciousness and the value of lucidity. She knows that true freedom is born when desire submits to conscience. And above all, she understands that fidelity is more a state of mind than a promise made to another. If this video touched any part of you, let the silence do the rest. Breathe, reflect, and if you wish, write in the comments what you felt, even anonymously. Sometimes, sharing is a form of healing. And if you want to continue delving into reflections like this, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Here, each theme is a gateway to self-knowledge, and each word is an invitation for you to walk a little deeper within yourself.